Hi folks, I'm Siadhal, one of the co-founders of Metaview. Incredibly excited to welcome you to this event, to have you here. We're going to do something a little bit different with this session. We're going to explore perspectives of both hiring managers and talent acquisition on how they work together, which is the key word, effectively. So the context here is that anyone that's been involved in any amount of hiring knows how vital that partnership is between engineering and TA, but it's also almost completely underexplored. And that doesn't really make any sense because hiring is such a cross-functional team sport. So that's what we want to change with this event and this series of events. So today, really delighted to be talking to Chong, who's VP of Engineering at Tally and formerly Director of Engineering at Twitter, and Beryl Wang, who is a senior tech recruiter at Tally, and obviously there she partners very closely with Jan and the other hiring managers to help them hire engineers. So very much looking forward to getting started, but before we do, just a bit of housekeeping for the folks in attendance. Obviously, we've not only got a couple of awesome guests, we also have some really awesome attendees. So engineering and tech recruiting folks from a lot of the most forward-thinking companies on the planet. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, please either add it to the Q&A section that you see on Zoom, or towards the end, I'll sort of flag that now's a good time to raise your hand and we can come to you live for that question. One thing I would say is please obviously try and keep the questions relevant to the topic, which is all about really the tactics of hiring engineers and building a world-class interview process. So yeah, try and really sort of anchor your questions around that. The other piece of housekeeping is just that there'll be a recording sent out later as well. Yeah, watch out for that. So first of all, Jan, Beryl, thank you so much for being generous with your time and doing this. And to kick off, and maybe Jan, come to you first. Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, sure. I've been working in tech for about 15 years, starting as a software engineer, fresh out of graduate school at a startup company, doing online gaming. Exciting, very different from what I do now. I then spent about 7 years at Twitter, where I had the privilege of leading a pretty large portion of the consumer engineering teams there. And then about 2.5 years ago, I joined Tally, which is a fintech startup that's on a mission to reduce financial stress through automation, starting with credit debt, which is where I am now.
Awesome. And Beryl, same to you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Beryl. So I have been in the recruitment space now for about 7 years. I started off doing non-technical and technical recruiting on the agency side of things. But early on, I always knew I wanted to go in-house at some point. So about 3.5 years ago, I joined Tally as our first technical recruiter.
Awesome. And thanks so much again for coming on here. Tally, obviously one of our favorite Metaview customers, and had a few conversations with both Jan and Beryl over the last few months. And I know there's a ton of wisdom we're about to unlock. So yeah, thanks again, folks.
You say that about all your customers, I'm sure.
You'll see. This will be recorded, so we'll see. It all depends on the entrance music. That's what determines how fun we go. So obviously, our aim is to double click on both of your perspective of what makes a successful partnership when you're hiring out your engineering team. Kicking off with you, Jan, what are the main areas where you think about when you think about how you and Beryl collaborate on building out the team?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we've worked together for 2.5 years, so we have a pretty good rhythm going. And I think we spend most of our time on hiring prioritization, overall headcount strategy, giving each other a sense of what the company needs, what we're seeing, and then just drilling down on tactical challenges that we're coming across in the hiring process, like who needs more coaching on various interview paths, or what are little blips that we're seeing in the process.
Yeah. And Beryl, same question to you. What are the main areas of collaboration from your perspective?
I feel like that has changed over the last couple of years. When first Jen joined, it was on something else, and now that we have matured and grown, we focus on other challenges. But in this moment, I think we also spend a lot of time looking at hiring trends in the market and revisiting our own hiring practices. Recruiting has seen a lot of changes over the last 2 years with the pandemic, and what used to be common trends aren't always such a given anymore. So we do spend a lot of time revisiting that.
Yeah. Awesome. What are Jan, when you think about working with someone in TA, partnering with TA, what are the one or two most important things that you look for from TA? What's important to you to get out of the partnership with TA?
Yeah, it's a little different at a startup company versus a big company where the roles are a little bit more specialized. Here, Beryl has to wear many hats, thinking both strategically and then executing as well on like a lot of the sourcing and hiring and like interfacing with candidates. So she kind of has to do everything well, which is a lot. So I look for organization, follow through. I think that's table stakes. Otherwise, I'm running around constantly trying to be like, did we get back to that candidate, or what stage is this candidate at? An openness to trying new things. I probably am a little obnoxious in that I think I do push my partners on the talent acquisition side a little bit. And then finally, a willingness to give feedback, because there's always going to be times when you have to change the process, revise the process. The other piece I found that is really useful, especially when we're dealing with a bunch of engineering managers. I work closely with Beryl, but it's not just me. I have a flock of like 10 or so EMs that also partner with her and her org when hiring. And whenever we want to come back and say like, hey, we want to do something else, or we think this is not really working, it's really, really helpful when the TA partner is data driven and can bring that analysis and perspective to the conversation.
Yeah, super interesting. I think that we see that a bunch, both with Metaviews and talent hiring, but also with our customers, that sort of almost like the cultural alignment between engineering and technical recruiting, I think is really not on every, I don't think necessarily on every, like every dimension or every vector, but yeah, love the things around follow through and that openness to trying things. I think especially this willingness to give feedback and understanding what perspectives you can bring to the table, but also understanding the perspectives, of course, the hiring team can bring to the table that the TA team might have less experience of, and that sort of mutual understanding that things can be learned from both sides of that, of the relationship, basically. Love that. Beryl, one or two things that you found that work really well to make sure the partnership with engineering is smooth, effective, and performant.
Yeah, this might be a given, but still important to call it is good communication. Given that we're all working remotely now, I think that's really key. But another big thing that comes to mind would be prioritization. So what I mean by that is making sure interviewing is the top priority for the engineers or whoever is on the engineering panel, given that hiring can be really time consuming or energy draining. So a really good hiring partner for me ensures that interviewing is factored into the team's workload, whether it's by sprints or whatever, but making sure that's factored in rather than interviewing being something the team has to squeeze into on the side of their work on top of all of the work that they're already committed to.
Yeah, and how do you do that right now? Is it one of those tactics that you mentioned where it's built into someone's expected output, or is it more of just again like a sort of a cultural thing of, hey, we will treat this as important, therefore prioritize this?
I would say a little bit of both. What has been really good about interviewing and hiring here as Tally is people really care about hiring good people. So I think intrinsically people just care a lot about it and they want to do well in it. So that helps a lot from both the interviewing and the hiring manager side. But then two, how we can help them with that is what at least what I do is reminding our hiring managers, hey, here are the people that are in a lot of interviews right now. Can we, look at that in their next planning session and making sure you're either having them commit to less things or letting them know that, like helping them with their prioritization on their project side, saying engineering hiring is first, but here are other things that you can also do if you have time.
Yeah,
I think that having it understood SLA, and this is more cultural at Tally, of like when you're supposed to respond and engage, because so much of good hiring process is being responsive and being able to move quickly, and like your interviewer's participation in that is critical to making that happen. That's where a lot of the lags on the company side can come from. At Twitter, I actually added hiring to the what do you call it, the ladder, the career ladder there as a category, because they felt really strongly that it was a core part of engineering's job at this point. Honestly, if you're at a healthy growing company, you're going to spend a ton of time interviewing and engaging in the hiring process as much as maybe not as much, but like doing code reviews. It's just part of the job.
Yeah. Do you have an upper limit on the number of interviews you expect any engineer to sort of conduct per week, let's say?
Yeah, usually it's 2 or 3. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, 3 is pretty. That's a lot. 3 interviews is a lot.
Yeah, 3 is what a lot of our customers sort of land at that 3. So some that sort of push up to 4 during certain periods, and obviously like maybe during university recruiting they spike and things like this. But yeah, that's pretty pretty common. Nice. Let's sort of get a little deeper. Can you give us an overview of what the actual interview process looks like at Teddy? Beryl, why don't you kick off if
Yeah, for sure. So at a high level, we have a 4-stage interview process. It always starts off with a recruiter call where we assess the candidate's like background, interests, and motivations to make sure that we're all aligned on expectations and Tally's ability to support their goals. So that's really important for us. We then have the candidate meet with the hiring manager. After that, there is some sort of technical assessment. It really varies between roles and what we're looking for, but it's either a live coding challenge or a take-home exercise. And then lastly, we have the final interview, which is generally a little bit longer, a couple of hours, and there's a mixture of technical, cross-functional collaboration, and a values assessment in there as well.
Yeah. Have you always done the HM screen prior to the technical assessment, or is that something you've played with to sort of like flip around the ordering there?
For the most part, it's always been this order, but we did play with it before, and the results weren't as good. Like I think having people dive into a take home is a lot to ask for when they haven't spoken with a hiring manager or like another human on this role. So we found that having this order worked out best for us. Yeah,
makes sense. And the HM screen, that is the person who will be this person's line manager, or is this sort of a global hiring manager like Jan doing HM screens, for example?
So we try to make that the direct line manager as often as we can. I would say 9 out of 10 times it is that case, but for some situations like say the hiring manager's on PTO or whatever, and we don't want to completely stop the pipeline, we will usually have that person's manager jump in. So it could be Jan, it could be another one of our engineering directors to help out with that.
Cool. And as long as you record the interview, then they can always check it out later, right? Cool. Current biggest hiring challenges, Jan, what's sort of top of mind for you? And it would be cool to know as well where you see the sort of the ownership of that challenge and how different elements sit between yourselves sort of as leading engineering and TA.
Yeah, I think for the past probably year, it's been scaling, trying to bring in a lot of new interviewers, a lot of new recruiters, and maintain that caliber of experience and assessment quality. And by experience, I mean candidate experience. I think we both own that and TA together. It'd be weird if it was like just me or just
That's exactly the rub, right? This is what we're saying, that this is such a team sport. It's such a shared goal. So great to hear both perspectives. Beryl, anything sort of different, any different flavors from your perspective on the sort of the top challenges?
Not so much. I think it was scaling for a really long time, so that's probably where our head is at. But I do want to double down on that collaboration between TA and engineering as being really key here, because I've definitely worked in some places where a lot of that is on on recruiting to roll out and to do, and the quality of the material that we put out was always never as good. Yeah,
makes sense. What current sort of processes or tactics do you have in place to make sure your teams, your people, your interviewers are prepared to interview well, whether they're new to Tally or just even new to interviewing in general? They could be sort of like, relatively early in their career. Is there any sort of like particular tactics, processes that you have in place for that?
Yeah, in a prior role, we used to do 2 shadow interviews and then just throw people into the loop. Sometimes they also got like this 1-hour training class, which is primarily focused on how to write really good feedback, but it was honestly kind of a mess. People would ask the same programming question twice in an interview, which is honestly like my biggest pet peeve ever, because it's such a waste of everyone's time. People would rate pretty randomly. This is particularly true for EM roles or roles that people haven't done a ton of interviewing for. You get some like really, really random numbers and assessments. I had someone who just like didn't believe in giving 3s, which was a higher rating, unless the candidate was like really, really exceptional. So trying to make a good hiring decision when you're working off data that was like so mixed in terms of context and background was really, really trying. So as a result, I believe super strongly in pre-prep and making sure everyone on the interview panel is aligned. what we're looking for, what we're going to do. I think it's more respectful to everyone's time, the candidate, the interviewers, the recruiters, the hiring managers. So I don't love sending people into an interview without an understanding of what they're trying to assess in the candidate and some of the questions we thought about prior to the interview. Ideally with a rubric, although that's a lot of work to get right. Beyond that, we've generally used shadowing in different forms to help get people aligned, and we played with that a little.
And these sort of getting this to this alignment on competencies, is that a written document that you provide to, obviously the shadowing helps with that, I know, but is there someone that's sort of like captured to sort of explain this is the competency board, this is the...
It's a little bit of everything. It depends. Like, is it a role that we're going to hire tons of, right? Because then you want to build that in different forms so that people can enter the process and still be assessing for the same thing, and maybe they don't need to have a larger alignment. Or if it is a one-off role, that we're pretty new to hiring like an EM for a particular role, or like we started hiring TPMs or product managers. They're going to work with engineering, and in that case, I bring everyone that I think is going to be on the panel together, and I literally go through a list of competencies to be like, this is what we're prioritizing right now for this role and why on that.
Yeah,
and I'm gonna.
And sorry, just to dig there, Jan, when you say bring everyone together, do you mean everyone that's going to be on the loop for a particular candidate, or is this a ceremonial thing before you've even started, getting candidates through the pipeline?
I do it as a kickoff, and I have a written document that captures, and I actually work with the whole team to say, hey, this is what I think is the priority of competencies and skills we're looking for and why. And I kind of force everyone to pare it down to 5 and order it, because it's like, everyone's a unicorn. You're not going to get like the Fulbright scholar that also helped orphans in Somalia, but also is like a Scala genius, right? Like I mean, maybe, but that's unlikely.
Keep looking.
And the idea is to force people to really think hard about what they really care about. And then, to be fair, when we evaluate, we have 2 candidates that have trade-offs. Well, we've already discussed why we value a particular trait over another and why we care. It also turns out, most people, when they think about EMs, are always like, I want someone who is an amazing people person, but also knows everything about this platform and can teach me and is a great communicator. And you're like, okay, again, how would you trade off against that? And I've had a lot of teams suddenly realize actually their EM is more in a facilitator role, and they are taking the charge on the technical side. So really they want someone who can represent them well, who can handle the stakeholders, especially on the product engineering side. And turns out that's really more important than they are an iOS expert or like a Kotlin genius, right, at the end of the day. So it's been a really useful process to be like, actually, these are the things they need to know when they come in the door.
Yeah. It's and Beryl, keen to come to you momentarily, but just a couple of reflections from my/Metaview's perspective is we're actually looking at the data recently of the most common areas of questioning that engineering managers face, and it is by far and away sort of people management and management style as opposed to technical assessment is what people end up focusing on. I think the other thing that that sort of anecdote really made me think, Jan, is your product teams your engineering product teams are so used to having to make compromises and trade-offs for the product they're going to build, and they realize, okay, you can't have everything right away, so we need to make tough decisions about what to build when. Yet there's like a cognitive dissonance when it comes to hiring. Like, no, we want all these things and we want it all right away. Like, clearly these things sort of work in a somewhat similar way. Like, you need to be educated, and you can still have a really high bar despite not needing such a broad cross section of top class skills. Anyway, sorry, Beryl. What about from your perspective? What do you see working well to getting folks at Tally interviewing sort of consistently and effectively?
A couple of things, but before I move on from what Jan was saying, I wanted to also add that even with this 5 prioritization process, it takes a couple of tries. Like, we have to have the panel do it the first time around, speak with a couple of candidates, and then they realize maybe what they initially thought they wanted isn't what they actually want. So it takes a couple of calibration conversations to like get it to a good point where we're all satisfied and happy with our top 5 priorities. So it doesn't always just happen overnight. So from my end, we also do shadowing a lot for sure. And we also do reverse shadowing, which is when the new interviewer leads the interview with the seasoned interviewer and tagging along. Just be there to like provide support and help when needed, and provide feedback afterwards. But aside from this type of like shadowing or rubric training, I also work really hard on bringing interviewers along the journey and sharing the why and the hows behind our process. So our interviews are structured in a way where each step focuses on a particular area of assessment, and no two areas overlap. So that way we don't ask the same questions to the same candidate. And some people find it difficult to land on a yes or no hiring decision based on only knowing like a small sliver of the candidate's background and skills. I think it's only normal that people want to get the full picture before pushing for their recommendation. So that's been a challenge. And I actually had the opposite scenario from Jan's interviewer, who didn't believe in giving threes. This interviewer almost always gave a no decision recommendation just because they were like paralyzed in their decision making. And you can imagine how difficult it is to make a hiring decision when people are constantly giving you no decision recommendations. So that's why I find it really important for interviewers to A, understand their area of focus, and two, know that while their recommendation is based off of that particular like single area alone, the team will look at the feedback holistically before making a decision.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I think shifting the sort of the interviewer's job from a hire, no hire decision, which is not necessarily the job of any one interviewer, across to a sort of endorsement or sort of, hey, I think they're not strong on this particular competency, and giving that context to the whether it's the decision panel, the decision maker, it's a big unlock for freeing people up to be more confident about their recommendation, even, which I think is worth it in itself. Jan, is there like a sort of a key signal that you sort of over-index on, something that, you know, a key signal that you have that you really want to make sure the interview process pulls out in general, or is it more sort of case by case than that?
I think it's very dependent on the skill. Like there's talents and skills that are teachable, and there's a whole bunch that are much harder to teach someone on the job. So for every role, I try to sit down and think through, and now I encourage my EMs to do recursively. What do we really need a candidate to come in the door knowing how to do already? And what can we really easily teach them while they're on the job? So as an example, we use Scala here at Tele, which I actually don't expect most people to know, both EMs or backend engineers. And you know, we're completely willing to interview in Java or other languages and teach them Scala on the job. So I would rate that as the highly teachable side of the skills, and not generally a prerequisite for a job in backend engineering for us. But something like communication skills or empathy in particular, these skills are still really coachable, but it takes a lot of effort to take someone who isn't really particularly empathetic and make them more empathetic. So what you see in that interview process is most likely roughly what you're going to get if you get that person to come work for you. And so with that in mind, I figure out which of these things are important due to the role, the business needs, the existing team composition, and then design really the interviews and the focus areas to assess for those. Sometimes you actually do need someone to come in the door as a Scala expert, like off the bat, because you just don't have time for them to pick up the language, or you need them to be that anchor for the entire rest of the team and teach the people you already have. So.
Yeah, super interesting. I love hopefully it doesn't get boring for folks, but I love analogies of those type of trade-offs with the product building analogies. And it's sort of very similar to the build versus buy, right? There are certain things that you want to hire someone in for, and you're sort of buying that skill. You want them to hit the ground with it as you described it. And other things that actually you want to build them around the way that you see, you know, the way that you see certain things. So for example, the languages you choose is much more malleable and people can turn their hand to it. Whether someone is an empathetic person, you know, as you said, you're never going to be able to build that into them. You just got to buy that in. So yeah, same sort of same thought process. Beryl, do you have any, again, similar question around sort of the tactics and processes you have in place, but this time around, how do you make sure you maintain sort of consistency throughout the interview process?
This is a meaty question. I think the general theme here is, though, like knowing what you're looking for helps with consistency. So you're not just not gathering the right data and kind of going out there in the wild and interviewing. So I remember several times where we would have two engineers meet the same candidate in the same step, and their feedback would be wildly different. We would get like a no and then a strong yes. And we had to spend a lot of time digging into the details to figure out what happened, and had to have these one-off conversations that ended up not being a one-off, ended up being like a regular thing. So I think knowing exactly what we're looking for and being able to break that down into the detailed rubrics Jan was talking about, and even creating a bank of pre-prep questions or asking smarter questions in general, and providing interview training really helps with maintaining the consistency across the board, no matter who is interviewing. I will say it does take a lot of time, especially when you're building all of this from scratch. But the difference here with like building these rubrics and having like these one-off conversations is scalability. You do most of the heavy lifting upfront one time, it will be brutal, but then you have it done, and you just do minor tweaks along the way. So that solves, I think, the material part of things. But having rubrics and interview training material, I don't think completely solves the issue of consistency across interview training. And I find that this challenge isn't just unique to engineering recruiting. We also had this pretty similar exact challenge when we were scaling out our own recruitment team. The big question we had on mind whenever we brought on someone new is, how do we get these new recruiters up to speed quickly so they're able to do a lot of these things on their own? And we started off also doing this like shadowing, reverse shadowing training, but recruiters are in literally so many interviews or meetings a day, it can be impossible to shadow everything. So we started recording our interviews, cataloging them, and sharing that out to new hires to help with their onboarding. So when we found out about Metaview, we were actually super excited because it was like a much more sophisticated way of what we were doing, which is populating things into Google Sheets, which is very prone to human error.
Yeah, I totally like Metaview has been hugely helpful. The customized coaching tips and feedback to the interviewers, the library of recorded interviews that we can set up training around. And actually, it's been, for me, nice to get an overview of how the interviews are going from a quality and experience perspective. It's a nice additional data point. We used to ask the candidates, I don't know if we did tell you, but at Twitter, we used to ask the candidates, and they're always saying like, oh, yes, because of course they want you to get them a job. So I'm always like a little skeptical of that data point there. And at Twitter, I actually did something more heavyweight where we would either audit or add a second interview to the loop in order to have paired interviews, so you get always a piece of feedback. But here in a startup company, that's a pretty heavy lift for us. And Metaview, I can kind of jump into different sessions and take a quick look at what's happening.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's awesome to hear. Jan, you and I talked about this previously, and I sort of had a lot of takeaways when we talked about it actually. Can you share a little bit more about how the actual decision gets made? So you've run this sort of highly consistent process. Everyone's really aligned on the what they need to be discovering and some sort of good ideas for the questions and how to get the signal they need. When it comes to the actual decision, what's important to you there? How does that get made?
Yeah, I believe in running a really well-structured hiring huddle where you pull everyone from the interview panel together and you make it snappy because that's pretty expensive, and you discuss the feedback. So to me, when that's done really, really well, it's a great opportunity for the hiring manager to get important clarifying information, discuss whatever concerns they have, and for the interviewers to get transparency about the hiring process, give feedback about the hiring process, and get feedback about what they've done. One thing that came out loud and clear from a previous role, I was behind a big effort to improve the hiring process at Twitter. And when we did the early survey of feedback from engineers who participate in the process, like, what do you want out of it? One surprise need, I mean, in retrospect, it's a little more obvious, but they said the interviewers really, really wanted to know if they were any good at interviewing, and if they were making good decisions for the company. But in a traditional interviewing setup, what was happening is they would interview, all that information goes to the hiring manager makes a silent decision basically, and someone either shows up kind of 3 weeks later or they never show up, and it's hard for people to learn and to grow their interviewing skills. So creating a quick huddle that hits all those points, that uses everyone's time really well, like, is a really nice way to cover many of those pieces.
Yeah, and you get different approaches where some folks will want to huddle for anything that's sort of like for every candidate who comes through to the on-site stage. Let's say other folks who think, hey, just use it for the ambiguous ones. Where do you sort of fall down this? Is it every single time, even if it got sort of 5 strong no's across the board, do you still do the huddle, or how do you think about that?
I think we default yes, especially in the early interviews, because everyone's kind of getting the hang of what we're looking for and how to refine that. If it's all strong no's and the panel has seen several candidates, then yes, often we will say, like, based on your feedback, we don't think it's necessary to talk about this, or we can do it in Slack.
So not dogmatic about it, biased towards having the thing, unless clearly there's a well-calibrated group who sort of know what they've seen. Okay.
The principle is transparency and feedback from my perspective. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Beryl.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say for that too, we normally won't have a huddle, but sometimes we will want to understand what we had missed in the earlier sessions. Like, is there something we could have caught? If this candidate got 5 strong no's, like that's pretty bad. That means we missed probably something pretty major in the beginning of the funnel, and we want to figure out what that is.
Yeah. So like you'd want to debug those ones. It's still a really interesting data point, just a different way of investigating it, I guess. What about tools? Obviously, you mentioned a couple so far, but it would be good to sort of understand what's in your stack to support your interview process.
We also use Talentwall and Greenhouse in addition to Metaview, which both Metaview, Talentwall, and Greenhouse, the idea is to get an overview of different aspects of the process. Talentwall gives us really good visualization of the funnel, while Metaview talks about the quality of the interviews. So it's kind of a nice piece together.
Yeah, nice. Do you have any examples of a time when the hiring process was suboptimal? So I guess nothing's ever perfect, but was there a particular time where you really had to sort of muck in, work together to improve it?
Yeah, we do. There was a time where we had challenges scaling out our backend engineering team. So the context here is that our technical needs were niche and our environment was quite complex. So the process at the time was long. Like there were 5 steps, including a 4-hour final and I think 3 technical assessments. So that was tough on the candidate, but it was also tough on the interviewers, given that the company back then was much smaller. So we had the same group of interviewers interviewing all the time. So we were worried about burnout from both the candidate side and our own side. So we knew we had to change something. It took a lot of work to get there, but we were able to tighten up this process by eliminating some steps altogether and coming up with completely new questions, especially around the technical side, that were smarter and can get us the right signal in a shorter amount of time. To help with this, we of course also had very detailed grading rubrics on what a strong yes looked like and what a strong no looks like to help reduce the mental load on all these interviewers so they don't have to think so hard or like so uniquely for each candidate. When they're writing a scorecard, they can follow the rubric. But ultimately, what helped us get to this stage was looking at the process from a balanced perspective and asking ourselves, how can we build and scale the team quickly without sacrificing either candidate experience or the quality of the data that we're gathering.
Got it. And just so I'm clear, the challenge, was it mainly that you had a relatively small population of trusted interviewers relative even to the size of the company at the time? Or was it just that your hiring needs were so high that you needed everyone to interview anyway?
Yeah, our hiring needs were so high, we needed everyone to interview, but the team back then was small. I think the whole company was about 60 people. So the engineering team was less than half of that at the time.
Yeah. Cool. Nice. Jan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, this all happened before I joined. So for me, I came in and I was like, oh, the interview process is in pretty good shape. It's actually one of the things I was really impressed with when I joined, when they explained it to me. At my prior role, on the other hand, I did a lot of work there to overhaul the interviewing process, bringing in rubrics, standardizing questions, practices that reduce unconscious bias in the process, in strong partnership with recruiting. I think my top 3 was bringing in multiple assessment role modes for the candidates so they can demonstrate their skill set in different ways rather than just one live coding over and over again, rubrics for evaluation and blind take homes when you can do it.
The multiple assessment modes, is that sort of you give the candidate a choice of how they want to sort of do the next stage?
It's more that in the, we have a take-home process so you can work on your own environment at your own time. You can look stuff up on Stack Overflow. You have Google, which is a much more naturalistic way of working, right? And then at Tally right now, we have a review of that gets into an architecture discussion where it's, again, more of a how you would actually collaborate with your coworkers in a code review or brainstorming like why you did that. And that's, again, a different mode of how you would display technical skill. Sometimes we also still do a live coding session, but just different ways to express different aspects of your job and that technical competency rather than just, whiteboard coding under pressure, highly artificial.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Let's move on to sort of a couple of closing questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. So I can see there's a few questions that have come through in the Q&A. If any folks want to add more questions, please do, or raise a hand, because we'll be coming to those in about 5 minutes or so. I guess more generally, sort of time to share some scar tissue, I guess. Throughout your careers, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see teams making in hiring technical talent?
I can start. I went to an engineering leadership unconference a couple years ago, and the key topic was hiring, and it was super crazy and really actually quite disappointing to see how all over the place people were and the different approaches people. And these were like director, senior director at Bang and like startup companies all coming together. So it wasn't, a very random assortment. And one person said, and this is totally true, and I almost laughed out loud when he said he'd like to sit on the floor because he's really tall to see how candidates handled that. And that was like his big tip on like how to hire. And I was like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? Like, what does that actually tell you? But my major takeaway from that experience was that if people haven't spent time thinking about hiring or talking to other people about hiring, what they generally assume is that the process that they hired them has to be a good process. So like, let's just go with that. And often those processes are like terrible. Like good people get selected all the time, but it might be kind of like random or very suboptimal or inefficient. So overall, the biggest mistake I see is not being clear on what you're actually looking for and then shaping your interview process just as for that. I think the second one that often happens is people jump into an interview, they have a vague idea what they want to talk about, and they're making questions up on the spot. And often they end up asking leading questions that are pretty easy to hear what the interviewer is looking for. That's especially true for soft skill roles like EM rather than senior roles.
Yeah, those leading questions often also consciously or unconsciously super open to bias as well, right? Because who do you ask the leading question to that sort of gives away, that sort of telegraphs what you want to hear, and who don't you, is sort of then becomes very hard to measure in the scorecard or in the debrief, because all you're going to relay is what they actually said. That idea around thinking the process that hired you is a good one, is thinking the process that hired you must be a good one is super interesting too, because I guess there's two ways to think of it. It could have been, especially in a world where each interviewer is not, there's no consistency. You might have gotten lucky and had some actual great interviewers during the process. And so you think, oh, wow, these folks must be great at interviewing. But actually, you sort of got lucky that you had the good ones. And actually, the candidate who was in the next day for their on-site session that had the other side of the interview panel may have had a terrible experience. This very, very, very true. You get the sort of survivorship bias. Beryl, what about you? What are some sort of classic mistakes you've seen and how to avoid them?
I think for me, it's how someone presents themselves. So I've seen teams give this more weight than I think it should. So like thinking someone knows what they're talking about just because they come across really confident and their mannerism or just how they present themselves, and then not really digging deeper into that because they think, oh, I'm sure this person knows what they're talking about. And then the flip side of that is thinking someone who is not as qualified or skilled or don't know what they're talking about because they might be more passive or quiet in their language. So that's why I think having like smarter questions and a more detailed rubric helps eliminate some of that.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Okay, last question from me. So final parting piece of advice that you'd give to team builders, whether that's hiring managers or talent acquisition folks that are looking to hire great engineers, what would that be? That piece of advice be? Jan, you first, please.
Your assessment's only as good as your interviewers. So your interviewers are representing your company. So prep them well and build a good process around them such that you're ensuring that you're getting good signal from everyone.
I would say focus on candidate experience. This will push you to be deliberate and thoughtful about the entire process and each stage in the whole end-to-end cycle.
Nice, awesome. Well, folks, thanks so much. We've got about 10 minutes left. So we've got a bunch of questions on the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye out to see if we have any hands raised. But if not, while people are sort of getting a chance to raise their hand, Stephanie, do you want to kick off with any questions we have from the Q&A?
Sure. So the first one is, from a training perspective, what do you do to ensure that scorecards have enough richness to be valuable contributors to a smooth decision-making process?
I can take that one. I don't know what ATS y'all use, but along with scorecards, you're usually able to set up attributes and competencies. So I would say identify the competencies you want each interviewer to look at and make sure that they address each specific competency in their scorecard. Try to have interviewers leave as many examples as possible, so that way they're able to recount a person's answer as opposed to, I think they said this, or I feel this. Like, we want some concrete examples for that.
Yeah. I think often as a hiring manager, what I'm asking is if someone says, hey, they're not good at this, or they, I'm asking what made you think that from the interview. So pressing to get the chain of events that actually caused them to reach that conclusion is really helpful. I will say that now that Metaview records the interviews, one thing that has been nice is that people don't have to focus so much on recounting exactly what happened and can focus a little bit more on the higher level analysis of the interview.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with the bit of pressure that people feel in a huddle to have a strong or like well-informed opinion, as they should. There should be that expectation that after spending that time you have it. Obviously, sometimes people can come away with sort of mixed feelings about exactly what they heard or whatever it is. So even just them being able to go back, I think helps. Beryl, just to, in fact, Jan as well, but based on both the answers, what is the sort of what is the forum in which the quality of people's scorecards gets sort of stress tested? Is it just that you review it and then sort of, on the side, we'll have a conversation with them about not being able to deduce much from what they've written? Or is it that live huddle where you will actually sort of have that interaction and say, well, why did you think this type thing?
Everyone in the interview gets to see everyone else's scorecards. So there's a little bit of shaming
Yeah.
on that aspect.
Cool.
Beryl.
But it's during the huddle, you'll say, it'll be a conversation that results in these. Okay.
We'll say it in the huddle, but we won't be like, hey, your scorecard was really light on details. It'll be like, can you expand on this? And then this person will realize that they didn't give a lot of detail.
Yeah, cool, awesome. Yeah, Stephanie, any other questions?
Yeah, this next one is about metrics. So what are the top, say, 2 most important metrics in your mind to get a sense of the health of your hiring machine? Would love to hear from both the Eng and TA perspectives.
Ooh, there's so many metrics. I mean, I think it's really different when you're setting it up and trying to get it going versus once it's kind of going and you're just making sure everything is good. When you're first setting it up, overall funnel metrics, what is the drop off at every stage and what does kind of normal look like? For me, one thing I spent a lot of time tuning, not at Tally, but at a previous role, was like SLAs, like how do we improve response times internally so that our end-to-end time with the candidate, like I think we were aiming internally for 2 weeks in the door to offer if it was successful, because I think speed is a really, really important element of being competitive, because they have an offer from you and they can stop looking, which sometimes they do, which is quite nice. So that was really important to me when setting it up. For a more mature flow, I mean, we're still looking at the funnel, but we have more, sense of it. So then we start looking at quality and more candidate experience pieces.
Yeah, I would say for sure quality from my end too. I focus a lot on the conversion rates between stages. So what does that look like from the recruiter screen to hiring manager screen to the technical assessment and then the final? Are we bringing quality candidates, or are we focusing on quantity, which is not what we want?
Yeah, cool. So that's the ones I noted down. Time to offer. So it's on a per candidate level, time from sort of seeing them them being in the pipeline to offer, converting them through stages. And then, of course, I guess the final conversion rate being the offer acceptance rate. That seems to be the main one. And from a candidate experience perspective, are you mainly looking at the sort of the offer acceptance rate as a proxy for candidate experience, or do you have a dedicated candidate experience, more qualitative measure that you look at?
I've never set up a specific we're playing with it, but it's been hard to get data consistently.
Yeah, completely. Nice. Stephanie, maybe time for one more question. So let's do one more if we could, please.
Yes, sure. So for the last question, other than evaluating candidates, one of the key objectives of an interview is to convince top candidates to want to work at your company. A, do you think it's harder to do the sales aspect of an interview in a remote process? And then second part of the question, what are some of the things that you do to get a candidate excited about potentially joining Tally during the process?
Interesting. I can go first. So I don't know if I find it harder to do the sales aspect. I think it's just different. Because you're still having a conversation with someone, and you can still do the salesy part of your interview, regardless if it's over Zoom or in person. So I think our interviewers are well equipped to pitch Tally as a product, as a company, but they're also prepared to talk about their own experiences here. And then, so that kind of feeds into some things to get the candidate get the candidate excited about joining Tally is we are very open with the candidates and offer like the opportunity for them to ask them anything they want about us.
Yeah, one interesting thing I noticed after I met a bunch of people that we hired during the pandemic in person is I think we actually ended up hiring more introverts than we would have actually during an on-site process. I think it's because it's a little bit easy for everyone to kind of have focused energy on a Zoom session rather than in person. I don't think this is good or bad. I just observed that was interesting side effect. One thing we definitely do is we help train our most frequent interviews, starting with the hiring managers, about how to talk about their experience at Tally and how to give compelling answers to common questions that you're going to get, using kind of almost like a standard comms framework, which is like, hey, this is the point you want to cut across. What's an authentic experience that you had here that really exemplifies that is truthful and honest, but also conveys and captures your excitement and what you love about the company. And so that's we make it, I think, very clear to everyone on the panel and internally, culturally, that like the interview is a process by which we need to share what we love about our company. So that's pretty top of mind for the interviewers. And I think it comes through.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm actually going to be checking out one more quick question because I just saw it on the list and I think it's a really good one. Jan, and this one's for you. Do you tend to find that the engineers in your team are sort of naturally excited about the interview process? And if not, even if they are, like, what have you done to sort of increase that engagement level with interviewing?
I mean, it's tough. Not everyone loves to do it. I think it's increasingly understood that it's like part of the job and not just this like chore that sometimes happens. People are definitely excited at the prospect of getting more teammates and having people to share the load, especially when they're a little the team is a little undersized for what they're doing. But on the flip side, that makes it even harder to take off time to do interviewing. I think what we've done is when you have a structured process, you make it as easy as possible for people to come in and out, right? Because you do all that pre-prep early. So it's like, you have to do this interview, but here are the questions. It's already been thought for you. Here's a rubric. So it's easy for you to just drop in as needed. So that reduces kind of the load, I think, on every single interviewer. But to be honest, what you can do is kind of explicitly say at this company, this is part of your job. And again, that's why at Twitter, I put it as part of the promotion process where you could get credit for it because it is a tangible amount. Like, you think 3 to 4 interviews a week, that's what, 2 hours roughly each in prep and feedback that you're doing plus a huddle. You know, that's like 8 to 10 hours a week. That's a lot when you're in a sustained hiring period. So I feel it's quite important to recognize that whenever you can, however you can.
Yeah, completely. I think that recognition and feedback loops around it is really important, which I think is one of the things that's getting better and better in the world. Is you do get feedback loops around how well you're doing at this. Are you getting better at it over time? And all these sorts of things that people just makes people care more. Awesome. We're at time. I think we're a little bit over time, so apologies for that. So I learned a ton. I hope the attendees did too. Love the closing thoughts around the sort of the hiring system only being as strong as the folks that are in it. Or another way to think about that is it's as weak as the weakest people in it, essentially, because you're going to have people going through that. So yeah, that's definitely resonates a lot with how we think about those challenges too. Jan, Beryl, thanks so much for being so generous with your time and for sharing your hard-earned secrets. We all really appreciate it. So thank you. And thanks also to all the guests. There'll be a recording sent round very soon. And I'd also want to add, we really appreciate any feedback on the event. So any feedback that comes to mind, please let us know. Any recommendations about other folks to feature on this series, any sort of like great partnerships you've seen between engineers and some acquisition folks, we're sort of pretty keen to speak to those folks too. So yeah, do get in touch with either feedback or recommendations. And yeah, Jan, Beryl, thanks again. And here's to well-engineered interviews. Cheers.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Super fun.
Bye-bye.